Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to Hamilton the Podcast. I'm Robbie Hurlocker.
And I'm Vinton Bayne. So today we're going to be talking about Aaron Burr, the unequivocal monstrosity of a villain here in our story who has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. Obviously just an angry, vengeful, murderous person who was only in it to destroy Hamilton's life. Or was he?
Dun dun dun! Leading into the big show-stopping number from Aaron Burr, Wait For It, is a reprise of the song The Story of Tonight, a song we heard earlier in the tavern scene when the revolutionary men were raising their glasses, making a toast to the revolution. Now you see that the wedding scene is over. We saw the wedding scene specifically from the angle of Eliza and then from the perspective of Angelica. Now we get to see that the men of the cast have retired to a certain room, they're sharing some drinks, and they're toasting to the death of Alexander Hamilton's bachelorhood.
But this is another place where the musical does something narratively that's not quite historical, because these guys weren't actually at the wedding.
Yeah, so the wedding was taking place in the southeast corner of the Schuyler mansion, and most of the guests were either Schuyler family or Schuyler friends. It was an incredibly disproportionate amount of the audience that was there in favor of the Schuyler family rather than the Hamilton family.
Yeah.
Hamilton reportedly only had one friend who was able to actually attend the wedding, to sit on his side of the aisle, so to speak, and that was a guy named James McHenry, one of his fellow aides on Washington's staff. Besides that, he didn't have anyone else there at the wedding specifically there for him.
That would look pretty lopsided if he had his own side of the aisle.
It does underscore the fact that the Schuylers are a family that Hamilton is marrying into. He's marrying into status. He's marrying up in the world because he couldn't have had this type of an audience for his own particular engagement.
But here in the musical, you see Lawrence, Mulligan, and Lafayette surrounding Hamilton, and they're toasting just like they did in Story of Tonight.
Yeah, they're almost actually roasting him at times. Or like, if the Tomcat can get married, if Alexander can get married, there's hope for our butts after all.
Yes. So you start off with the line repeated, "I may not live to see our glory." And that's actually spoken by Lawrence first.
Right.
And that's holds a little bit of significance, because Lawrence does not live to see the glory.
Yeah, he doesn't even live to see the second act of the show. My favorite restructuring of the line here is when Lafayette says, "Raise a glass to freedom," and in the tavern scene at the beginning, they said, "Something they can never take away." But here, you see at the wedding, the jesting is going back and forth. They're like, "Raise a glass to freedom, something you will never see again,"
Right.
No matter what she tells you.
Kind of what you would expect your friends to tell you at your wedding.
I hope I didn't say anything like that at your wedding.
I don't think you did.
I think I gave a pretty good best man speech.
You definitely did. Much better than "you'll never see your freedom again."
Right.
And actually, Hamilton himself kind of had a little bit of this view of his marriage this way. He wrote to Lawrence, and in that letter, he said about his engagement, "Next fall completes my doom. I give up my liberties to Miss Schuyler." Obviously, there was a little bit of jest in this when Hamilton wrote it. He loved his wife and wanted to get married. This was a choice he made.
Mm-hmm. And here again, you have that theme repeated about upward mobility and marrying into wealth, where Mulligan just says it outright. He's like, "To the newly not poor of us," because Hamilton's no longer poor.
Exactly.
He's part of the most powerful, richest family in that area.
And then, well, if it isn't Aaron Burr.
I didn't think that he would make it.
To be sure, he did.
He did, actually. Not historically.
Not historically, just in the musical.
Lots of writers have commented on the relationship between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton before the famous duel. At this point in their lives, they got along pretty well. Everyone talks about how they socialized at parties, they had different events together. Even once they started their law practice, they were willing to engage with each other in a really friendly, respectful manner. And that's what you see in this scene. They come together, Burr comes in to say congratulations, and he wants to be a part of giving his best wishes to his friend Alexander Hamilton.
Then Mulligan does a very similar thing that we saw when they first get introduced to him. "Spit a verse, Burr."
Yeah, take a stand, spit a verse.
But he completely ignores it, and then Lafayette calls him the worst. Hamilton, on the other hand, though, speaking of that friendship, says, "Ignore them. Congrats to you, Lieutenant Colonel." Which shows, again, Hamilton's desire to be a part of the war, not just writing letters for Washington.
Yeah, when he says, "I wish I had your command instead of manning George's journal."
Yep.
And there's that direct conflict again, where you see that Burr's like, no, you couldn't rather have this than what you have, because you've positioned yourself in such an incredible place, seated at the right hand of the Father. You're here in a place where you're going to climb. And he says specifically, be sensible, Alexander. From what I hear, you've made yourself indispensable.
Yeah. And actually, just as a small note, this is another play on time in the musical, because Burr was actually commissioned in 1777 and Hamilton was married in 1780. So chances are 3 years later, Hamilton knew about this and congratulated them a long time ago.
Yeah. And then Gossip Pants, John Lawrence, comes in and says, well, Aaron Burr, I hear you've got a special someone on the side.
And that actually piques Hamilton's interest a little bit. Is that so?
I like imagining John Lawrence. I mean, they've obviously had a little bit too much to drink here. They've been toasting, they've been drinking all this stuff, and he's almost getting juvenile as he's like poking at Aaron Burr, saying, what are you trying to hide, Burr?
Yeah, exactly. To which Burr responds, I should go.
Yeah, it's like he's getting nervous or uncomfortable all of a sudden.
But then Hamilton, showing this friendship that they actually have right now, stands up for Burr against his closer friends.
Yeah, he says, these guys should go, you should stay here and we should have our own talk, which definitely makes Lafayette, Lawrence, and Mulligan a little bit upset. They're like, oh, man.
Then Hamilton says, it's all right. I wish you would have brought this girl with you tonight, Burr.
Yeah, it's a super respectful conversation between the two of them, and Aaron Burr says, you know, you're very kind, but drops the bomb. I'm afraid it's unlawful.
Yeah, it was unlawful because he was shacking up with a girl who was married already to a British officer.
Oh, man.
Then Burr says, congrats again, Alexander, and reminds him, smile more.
I love this repeat of the first conversation that they ever had, where Aaron Burr's advice was, talk less, smile more, don't let them know what you're against or what you're for. Here it takes a much more lighthearted tone, where it's just like a, hey, smile more. You're married now, guy.
Yeah, to which Hamilton replies, I'll never understand you. If you love this woman, go get her. What are you waiting for? Which is how Hamilton sees Burr. Like, I could see that question being asked about Burr's whole life from Hamilton. What are you waiting for? What are you waiting for? Do something. If you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. What are you waiting for? Go.
Yeah. When I first heard this line, it made me really uncomfortable, because you see here our hero of the story as it's being told basically getting married and then immediately advising someone to pursue a married woman.
Right.
Which seems really, really uncomfortable. Lots of people read into this from different angles. They talk about, well, Hamilton was a little tipsy here, so he doesn't really know what he's talking about. Or maybe he is hinting at his own marital infidelity later on, something like that. I think here it's just really emphasizing the difference in their personalities,
right,
where
exactly.
Hamilton is pursuing something and Burr is waiting back. He's going to wait for something, and you see them say their goodbyes. I'll see you on the other side of the war. And Aaron Burr goes into another song entirely devoted to explaining his own philosophy of waiting for it.
I believe this is my favorite song on the recording here. Wait for it.
It's one of the songs that I feel like it could actually be released as a single, and we would listen to it all the time.
Which is surprising that on a musical about Hamilton, the song I feel most likely could be released as a single is a song about Burr.
Oh, yeah. So he begins by diving into this relationship that we've already hinted at. Theodosia writes me a letter every day. I'm keeping her bed warm while her husband is away. So let's talk a little bit about Theodosia Prevost.
Yeah, she was 10 years older than Burr. Already married, obviously, as we mentioned. She had 5 children with this British officer who would later die, and Burr would marry her.
Yeah. So I think her husband was actually stationed in Jamaica for quite a while in the British colony there, but then he moved to Georgia and was fighting on the side of the British, trying to keep the colonies on the side of the king, trying to keep everything from going the way that Alexander Hamilton and ultimately Aaron Burr wanted it to go.
Right.
Theodosia Prevost was a singularly impressive woman who had to deal with a lot of persecution because of the fact that her husband was on the British side. So like the county commissioners actually tried to serve her with papers that would actually take and confiscate all of the property that her husband owned. Oh. And so here she is living on the farm, on the plantation, trying to raise her kids, trying to keep everything afloat. And just by the nature of the fact that her husband is an officer for the British, the government is coming and telling her, we're going to confiscate all of your stuff.
Yeah.
And at that time, she had some very powerful friends because Theodosia knew how to play the political game a little bit. She was a very intelligent woman. She often quoted Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Mary Wollstonecraft, and she was a very well-educated person who knew how to entertain people like George Washington, James Monroe, Robert Troup, people who were very big names on the colonial side, and so she was very much someone that had connections. There was a point in time when James Madison and Robert Troup actually went to become legal counselors for her, and Troup pointed out that, here's the quote, I just found it, "Theodosia is the wife of an enemy. What then? Must we abandon human nature in order to manifest our patriotism? I can affirm that Mrs. Prevost is a sincere and cordial well-wisher to the success of our army." And so here she actually hosted George Washington a lot,
Right.
hosted Aaron Burr's troop a lot of the times, which was kind of a cover for them to get a little bit more familiar with one another. So in the middle of all of this drama and this stress, she actually was one who was able to rise up, who was able to rise above the oppression and really put forward this fantastic image of what it means to be a strong, independent woman in this kind of a context. A lot of historians talk about Aaron Burr and Theodosia like Aaron Burr is this big womanizer who's here to impose on their relationship. But really, if you look at their correspondence, Aaron Burr looked at Theodosia like an equal. He was writing letters to her on a really scholarly level. They were talking to one another about philosophers and about really big political concepts and about the rights of women. And they actually were intellectual equals. They were intellectual peers with one another. In Milton Lamasque's biography that I'm going through, this 2-volume biography, he talks about how no one really commented about Theodosia's outward appearance. She wasn't someone that was just striking like some of the Schuyler sisters were whenever people visited them. But Aaron Burr was absolutely attracted to her mind.
Yeah, it was like a melding of minds, even more than it was a melding of bodies.
Yeah, they had this really, truly egalitarian relationship between the two of them.
So her husband's actually stationed down in Georgia, and at one point he sent a letter for her to come be with him, to bring the children and come live in Georgia.
Yeah, but she decides that she is more comfortable where she is. Mm-hmm. She does not go down to join her husband. Some historians have commented on this and talked about how basically this is her not pursuing a divorce, but basically saying, I've chosen to be separate from you. So they're separated but not divorced,
right, because
there's this distance, and she's basically decided to stay where she is instead of joining her husband.
Which is fine with Burr because he can keep all of Georgia. Theodosia, she's mine.
Oh, yeah.
So another interesting thing I heard about involving Theodosia was this game called Crambo. Robbie, tell us a little bit about that.
Ron Chernow talks about this, and Nancy Isenberg definitely talks about it a little more too. But this was a game that a lot of really rich, wealthy, well-to-do families would play after dinner, where you basically challenge each other to come up with sonnets, come up with poetry. They're basically freestyling back and forth against one another. They give each other words. It would have fit in really well with Lin-Manuel, and like Lin-Manuel and Theodosia would have probably been able to kick it pretty well back and forth with one another, because apparently a lot of people commented on how quick-witted she was and how quickly she could come up with fancy rhymes and fancy rhyming structures in these just little after-dinner games where they played these freestyle rhymes where they were basically just freestyling.
Yeah, it was almost like the precursor by 200 years to the rap battle.
Yeah, exactly. So here Aaron Burr hits this beat that's going to be hit at least 3 times throughout the song. He says, love doesn't discriminate.
Death doesn't discriminate.
And life doesn't discriminate.
And Hamilton doesn't hesitate. And I find it really interesting here that this song, pretty much from Burr's perspective, compares Hamilton to such powerful forces as love, death, and life.
Yeah, it almost puts him on the same level, elevates him up to this status.
Yeah.
In this song, Aaron Burr describes some of the trauma that he dealt with as a kid in his family, and he's going to talk about the things that he's overcome, the things that have made him laugh and cry throughout all of his life.
So he goes into discussing his family a little bit here. He says his grandfather was a fire and brimstone preacher, and he's talking about the actual really famous Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah, you and I are both theology nerds, and we love talking about theology and the history of the church. Jonathan Edwards is kind of a big deal in the New England colonies in general.
Yeah, you could call him the fire and brimstone preacher, actually.
Right. One of his most famous sermons was this really long-winded sermon in this hot church building. It's called sinners in the hands of an angry God. And the whole thing is like, you are an awful, despicable person, and God is looking at you, holding you like a spider over a fire, and it wouldn't hurt him one bit to just drop you into the flames because that's what you deserve as an awful, terrible person. But it's only because of God's grace that you have any chance of survival.
Yeah, right. So he kind of kick-started the fire and brimstone preaching here in America. So you kind of see that this family that Burr's coming from here.
And then Burr, like a good son, speaks very highly of his mother. His mother was a genius.
Yeah.
And, say what we will about Calvinist preacher Jonathan Edwards, he really did believe in educating his children to know how to read, how to write, how to be strong, well-spoken people, both his daughters and his sons. He trained them up well. And so his mother really was a well-educated woman.
Yeah, and then it goes right into his father, who commanded respect.
What can you tell us about his father?
So he helped found Princeton College and was the president at that college for 9 years.
Yeah. He was also a reverend for a while.
Right.
Aaron Burr had preachers on both sides of his family. So, interestingly enough, before he went on to found and lead Princeton College, Aaron Burr's daddy, Aaron Burr Sr., he was named after his father, he was also studying to be a reverend. So he had preachers on both sides of the aisle. And historically, we like to look back and see New England from church history like this big, huge block of Calvinist theology, but there was a lot of back and forth and some disagreements between the Arminianists and the Calvinists, and the Episcopalian church was kind of growing up a lot at this time. Aaron Burr Sr. actually started out his studies as an Arminian, and then he heard Jonathan Edwards speak, and he actually basically had this big, long letter that he wrote out saying, God's grace has finally found me, and I am now on the right side of this theology. I'm now all about God's sovereignty and the fact that we need grace in order to be able to be anything good, because I am face to face with my own depravity and brokenness. So it's interesting that both sides of his family were kind of drawn towards that patriarch of his mother's family, Jonathan Edwards.
So with that kind of a legacy of pastors, it's interesting that Burr didn't pursue that.
Yeah, interestingly enough, he actually did for a little bit.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he actually went to school, and he, at a certain period of time, he thought he was going to go into religious studies. He thought he was going to be a preacher in general.
Huh.
Looking back, we can see that he immediately decided, you know what, this religious thing is not for me.
Probably too much politics in the church. That's why he decided to go with government.
Right. There are things that the homilies and hymns just won't teach you.
Right.
I kind of relate to this guy here because I am the son of a preacher man and the grandson of a preacher man. It runs in my blood. And here today, I do not.
But you are quite into politics.
That's true.
Interestingly enough.
Interestingly enough.
So speaking of his family here, that leads us right into the next line. Death doesn't discriminate. And Burr had a lot of death in his family, a bit of tragedy.
Yeah, just to summarize a lot of things happening all at once when he was a kid. By 1758, Aaron Burr was 2 years old, and he had already lost a mother, a father, a grandfather, a grandmother, and a great-grandmother, all of whom he had tried to move in with for a little while. They were each going to take over this baby for a while. And so even though Aaron Burr lacked any memory of these gruesome events, he actually was even more emphatically orphaned than Alexander Hamilton was.
Yeah, even kind of a weird note that I had read was that his grandma died on her way to come collect Aaron and his sister of dysentery. It's like, this guy can't catch a break family-wise.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. He lost a lot of family members to smallpox, and he lost his grandmother to dysentery.
Right.
It's so sad. Ultimately, Aaron Burr, as a baby, did end up moving in with his uncle, the Reverend Timothy Edwards. And he lived with Tim Edwards until he was ready to move to Princeton at a whopping age of 13 years old.
Yeah, you don't see many 13-year-olds going to college.
Right.
You'll recall when Hamilton asked him about why he went to college so early, he said it was the last thing that his parents had wished before they died.
So Aaron Burr really does have a legacy to uphold. He talks about how he has this thing he has to defend. His family name is important to him, both on the Edwards side and on the Burr side. He has people that were well known in society, and he wants to make sure that he does right by them. So he says, if there's a reason that I'm still alive when everyone who loves me has died, then I'm willing to wait for it. He's willing to make sure that he defends the legacy that his family has set forth.
Yeah, and you see the opposite in Hamilton. Just like Burr said at the beginning of this whole musical, the bastard orphan son of a whore. If you come from that and that's your legacy, you have nothing to lose but everything to prove. Just like Burr says here in the musical.
So Hamilton's pace is relentless. He wastes no time at all. He's pushing ahead, making sure he does everything he can to get into where he builds a legacy. But Burr knows he has everything to lose. And so he's willing to wait to make sure he doesn't lose that legacy.
Just to go back a little bit, Burr's mindset of wait for it is explained a little bit in this line, I'm not standing still, I'm lying in wait.
Yeah, Aaron Burr cannot be characterized as the lazy, no ambition character that some people like to paint him as. He absolutely was ambitious. He was pursuing something. He was just doing it in a way that he wanted to be smart about it. He wanted to take his time and make the right decision about it. He's lying in wait for the right opportunity to seize.
Yeah. This next part of the song is interesting to me. It shows kind of Burr's confusion because he has this mindset, this philosophy for life that is not compatible with Hamilton's mindset and philosophy for life. So he asks this question, what's it like in his shoes? He doesn't hesitate. He doesn't exhibit any restraint. He takes and he takes, and yet he keeps winning anyway. And it's like this idea of frustration of, I don't understand. My philosophy is the right philosophy that should bring progress and success. And yet instead, Hamilton doing the exact opposite is the one getting all the success.
Yeah, exactly. Musically, one of the things I love in this song is how they actually use silence.
Yeah, there's a few moments where the lyrics or the music drops out and you actually have an extended beat where normally if you would try to jump in and sing along, you would miss that beat only to be caught off guard by Burr coming back in and saying, wait for it.
Right. I think that that's something that a lot of musicals don't use enough is that pause, that time between beats where you actually see he's singing about waiting for it, and then all of a sudden you have 3 whole beats of no sound at all before the chorus swells back up and comes back in with the rising melody to finish this whole song out.
I said earlier that this song is one of my favorite songs from Hamilton, and I think that's because of Leslie Odom Jr.'s performance here and the powerfully orchestrated music.
Oh yeah.
It's just beautifully intertwined together and gives you this emotionally driven feeling where you get chills when you listen to it. You get pumped when you listen to it. And I actually like to just put it on repeat and listen to it. I put this in my shuffle with other music just to come up randomly because it is that single, like we mentioned earlier. It is a good song just to listen to outside of the narrative even.
Yeah, it's really a fantastic song. So I want to talk a little bit just generically about the character of Aaron Burr in history, because this character in the musical has absolutely inspired me to read a lot more about him, because he is not at all two-dimensional. He's not at all a simple villain from our history books. He is a complex, talented person who had a lot going for him and has been painted in a specific light, often because of the things that Hamilton said about him.
Yeah, even the musical itself mentions that because of this act, he's now a villain.
Yeah, because of the duel.
Yeah. And there are actually groups out there like the Aaron Burr Association who are out there trying to spread the message of the good news of Aaron Burr, trying to remind people that he was a man of good character, that he had positive sides to him, and that Hamilton isn't necessarily the hero of the story always.
Yeah, that's a big conspiracy group back and forth, because some people will look at the two individuals, and obviously Chernow is a Hamilton apologist and Lin-Manuel is a disciple of Ron Chernow. But you see in history that things are not as easily reduced to just the good guy, bad guy dichotomy. They both did terrible things, and they both did some pretty great things as well.
We owe a lot to both of them for where our country is.
Right, and obviously Alexander Hamilton did the more visible, bigger things.
Sure.
Like, he absolutely had the bigger place of prominence in our history as Americans, but Aaron Burr no less deserves our attention.
Yeah. And on that note, during my research, I found an Aaron Burr Association website, and they actually list out reasons why they admire Aaron Burr.
Oh, I want to hear these.
So number one is he recognized over 200 years ago that women should be educated as men are educated. He set up a school with Madame de Senat, which I'm sure I'm saying wrong, for young ladies in New York City in 1793.
Right.
In the assembly, he worked for political rights for women. As disciples of Mary Wollstonecraft, again, probably saying it wrong.
Yeah.
Mr.
Vindication. She wrote Vindication of the Rights of Woman.
Yeah. Mr. and Mrs. Aaron and Theodosia Burr were considered the first feminists in America.
And that's absolutely true. We talked on our Schuyler Sisters episode a little bit about how he was very pro-education for women. He tried to get his daughter the rights to inherit land and property. He wanted to educate women on the same level of the men around them. And he did envision a future America where the gender roles would not be so divisive. And he was definitely forward-thinking for his day. A lot of his journals were addressed towards a female audience. He started writing letters to his sister in his journals, and then eventually to his wife Theodosia in his journals, and then to his daughter Theodosia. And so he shares a lot of his intimate thoughts with a female audience in mind, fully expecting that women have as much, and in some cases higher, intellectual capacity and potential as men do.
Yeah, it's great stuff. Number 2 is, as vice president, he fought off President Thomas Jefferson's plan to impeach Judge Samuel Chase. Burr is why there is a separation between the judicial and executive branches.
Yeah, I feel like that gives him a little bit too much credit there.
Probably does.
Like a lot of the founders fought for the division between the judicial and the executive branches. But he did preside over the impeachment trial of of Samuel Chase, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah. After the duel with Hamilton, he came back in, and it was kind of a big controversy where they said, here's this vice president who's indicted for murder in a couple of different states, who's standing trial over a judge who's just being impeached for bad things he said at the bench. And he did decide at the end that we can't, as the legislative branch and the executive branch, take over everything that the judicial branch is saying. So he did uphold in the end the division of the independence of the judicial branch. So that's fair. Probably overstating the fact there, though.
Yeah. Number 3, he supported the education of talented youth, such as his daughter Theodosia. Considered the best educated young lady of the 1790s, painter John Vanderlyn, Washington Irving, and Martin Van Buren. Dolly Madison appointed Burr guardian of her son.
Oh, nice.
So he was an advocate of young people wanting to succeed and go farther and to do better things.
Yeah, that's cool. What else did they say?
Number 4, Colonel Burr was a Revolutionary War hero who at 19 survived a winter crossing of Maine, where 600 out of 1,100 starved to death. He saved General Knox's brigade, stopped a mutiny at Valley Forge, and defended a bridge so New Haven residents could escape the British.
Yeah, his military career was one that lots of people talked about as a very well-decorated military career. There's a point in... Oh, man. Let me grab this book. If you guys haven't heard of it, I highly recommend the book Nancy Isenberg wrote called Fallen Founder, The Life and Times of Aaron Burr. I've been going through this. I have a few chapters left in it. I'm almost done. It's a fascinating read. It's a great complement to everything that Ron Chernow wrote in the Alexander Hamilton biography. I'm kind of at this point where... one of our favorite preachers in New York City is named Tim Keller, and he has a quote in one of his books where he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but if you read one author, you'll become a clone. If you read 2 authors, you'll become confused. And if you read 10 to 20 authors, you'll begin to develop your own thoughts and your own perspective on these things. Yeah. I'm at the point where I've read Ron Chernow's interpretation of Aaron Burr, and I've read Nancy Isenberg's interpretation of Aaron Burr, so I am at this point of being confused.
Now you're confused.
Yes. There are so many different perspectives to their entire relationship. The Hamilton-Burr relationship is so complicated. There are so many things that Hamilton said. Hamilton frequently attacked Aaron Burr's character, Aaron Burr's personality, Aaron Burr's family and life, and the way he lived. Aaron Burr, in response, only ever attacked Hamilton's politics.
Yeah.
He kept things professional. He thought that you should be able to be friends with people who are your political enemies. You shouldn't have to get personal and run attack ads like Hamilton did against Aaron Burr. But on that note about, I got off track, but on that note about the military legacy of Aaron Burr, I want to read this quote from page 211 of Nancy Isenberg's biography. One of Aaron Burr's fellow legislators was describing the merits of Aaron Burr versus Thomas Jefferson as to who should become the next president of America, and he says specifically, Burr never penned a Declaration of Independence, I admit, but he has done much more. He has engraved that declaration in capitals with the point of his sword. It is yet legible on the walls of Quebec. He fought for that independence for which Mr. Jefferson only wrote. He has gallantly exposed his life in support of that declaration and for the protection of its penman. He has been liberal of his blood, while Mr. Jefferson has only hazarded his ink. So even back in those days, Aaron Burr's legacy as a soldier was giving him a leg up over his political enemy at that point in time, Thomas Jefferson.
So that brings us to number 5. He was the senator who the other senators chose to write the welcoming speech to President Washington for the opening of the October 1791 Senate session. Vice President John Adams read the speech Senator Burr wrote. Adams later nominated Burr to be a general. Why is that in parentheses?
He says in parentheses.
Yeah. Burr tried in vain to persuade the other senators to permit the public to attend debates. Burr's farewell speech in 1805 was the greatest oration ever delivered in the Senate, which sounds like opinion to me, but when I brought that up to you, you actually brought up a good point.
Yeah, so when Aaron Burr decides to actually leave office, and we can debate about whether he decided or whether he was forced out in general, but when he leaves office as vice president, he gives this speech in front of the Senate that is so emotional, so raw, so vulnerable, where he's talking about his own goal for America and politics and how we can be civil about these things. And he talks about this thing in such an emotional way that he leaves the room. He does this like mic drop thing where he's done speaking. He walks out of the room, kind of slams the door. And then apparently one of the legislators was saying for a full 2 to 5 minutes, no one spoke. And everyone had tears in their eyes talking about how emotional this moment was. So I haven't actually read the speech. I haven't heard it, but it would be fascinating to see because I've heard about that particular phrasing of that being the best speech that was delivered there. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, it sounds powerful.
Yeah.
So number 6, he adored and was always faithful, which, pausing here, I feel like that's a bit of a slam against Hamilton that they're throwing in there. He was always faithful to his wife, who was 10 years older, and devoted to his 11-year-old daughter when his wife died of cancer.
Yeah.
He wrote his daughter, quote, "I am inclined to you, my dearest Theodosia, for a very great portion of the happiness which I have enjoyed in this life. You have completely satisfied all that my heart and affections had hoped or ever wished."
And we know from this musical that Hamilton will never be satisfied.
Yeah. Number 7, he stood up to the aristocrats by figuring a way for the common man to vote by having a group of them buy property together.
Yeah, and that's actually a really big point because at that point in time in New York politics, you really did see that the landowning elite were the ones that really had a voice. And so he did kind of open the door to more people being able to speak up. And the Federalists held their power in that area very much because they were the landowners and the wealthy elite.
Yeah, and so as a continuation of that, number 8 here, he started the Chase Manhattan Bank to lend money to the Democratic Republicans when the only bank in town, the Bank of New York, would only lend to the opposing aristocrats in Hamilton's Federalist Party.
Yeah, he was kind of a sneaky little sucker when he did that too. Like he snuck that in. If I remember correctly, he set up like the Manhattan Water Company and he sold this to them. He pitched this to the government as, well, we need a water utility company that's going to build these things. Oh, by the way, it's also going to be a bank. And like he also were being able to accept donations and money and build up money and loan money and things. And so
read the fine print.
Yeah, he was one of America's first real politicians by today's understanding of politicians.
Yeah.
And on the board of that bank, he brought in enough Federalists, including a relative of Alexander Hamilton. He brought in one of the Schuylers. I think he actually brought in Angelica's husband, John Church, to be a representative on that bank's board so that the Federalists would not attack it as much.
Wow.
Because at that time, the Federalists owned the banks. They owned that area.
Yeah.
They could run everything as much as they wanted to. But since there were influential Federalists on the board, they were like, okay, I guess we won't actually shut down their bank. But it was a way in for the Republicans in New York, the New York Republicans specifically, to have a voice outside of what the Federalists were doing.
Yeah. So number 9 here is actually a really big one. When the New York Assembly voted to gradually abolish slavery, he proposed that they immediately abolish slavery in 1785. As a lawyer, he would petition that slaves arriving on boats from Africa be freed, thus making him the most radical anti-slavery force of early America, quote unquote.
Of course, he also owned slaves, so he kind of had a mixed history there.
Sure. Yeah, I guess they're not going to mention that part when they're telling you why they admire him.
Right, exactly. He did, though, have some very interesting progressive ideas there when he was a part of the New York Senate and when he was a part of his actual law practice. He represented some freed slaves who were basically being oppressed by their system, and so he did represent them there. He also represented a lot of slave owners, and so, like, yeah, he was kind of a mixed bag when it comes to the abolition thing,
Sure.
but they are right that he did put forward some really progressive policies at different times.
Yeah, I mean, this list goes to show what you said earlier. You read one person and you're a clone, you read two people and you're confused.
Yeah, definitely.
So number 10, he led a group of pioneers to settle a tract he bought in Louisiana and defended himself successfully to be declared not guilty in 3 court trials against false treason charges, launched by political enemy President Jefferson. The prosecution offered bribes to witnesses who would testify against Burr, but none could against the team of lawyers directed by Burr. The Burr conspiracy was a myth.
Man, that's probably the most biased of all the points that you just read. Like, from one perspective, you see on the extreme opposite side that people kind of accused him of basically wanting to become the emperor of Mexico, like taking an army of his own raising across the border into the Spanish-owned territory and trying to basically annex these areas for himself. And then some people talk about how maybe he wanted to march on Washington to take the government away from Thomas Jefferson. He definitely was misrepresented in those trials. He was definitely villainized and was poorly represented, and he did rise above it. So, I mean, that's fair.
Right.
But there's definitely more perspectives on that particular point in general. When I was reading about that in Nancy Isenberg's biography, she uses the word filibuster, which, like, I'm a political nerd. We've established this. I like listening to the Senate debates. I will watch it on C-SPAN for no reason except to enjoy it.
On that note, actually, a video I was watching where someone was talking about Burr in one of these Burr associations of some sort. I don't think it was the same one here. He mentioned something that they had done where they gave some kind of speech or talk, and then he threw in casually, "You probably saw it live on C-SPAN." And my first thought was, who was watching that live on C-SPAN? Who are you talking to?
It was probably Robbie. It was probably me.
Robbie.
But the word filibuster, apparently, this is new to me, vocabulary word of the week, it can be used for someone who stands up and speaks to block a bill on the Senate floor, who's just trying to talk long-winded for a really long time, or it can be used to raise your own military force and go into occupied territory to annex it for yourself. And so it's like a military term. I didn't know that. I was super confused. I eventually had to put the book down and Google it on my phone.
Interesting.
Because I was like, oh, filibustering.
That's not how we know it today.
Right, but Nancy Isenberg used that word like 10 times in 2 pages. It was kind of obnoxious. I had to research it.
Interesting. So that was Why We Admire Burr, a webpage found on AaronBurrAssociation.org, where you can go to find more information on that.
But I think we need to definitely tell our listeners, don't take that just exactly as it is, because you need to take it with a spoonful of sugar, because that website is very hateful towards our boy Hamilton, our hero in our own musical, the one that we know and love, and we are ready to defend in this particular story. And so if you go there, great. Get 2 sides of the story.
Exactly.
But don't take it completely on its own merits.
Yeah. So I said in the beginning that Burr is this unequivocal monster of a villain. I was being a bit facetious.
Yeah, I didn't know where you were going with that. I thought it was awesome.
I just wanted to show that there's 2 sides to every story here. Mm-hmm. Burr is not just a monster of a person.
Right.
He's a human being who did a lot of great things, and there's reasons for him reacting the way he did to certain things that Hamilton did. And I think it's really great to know and respect these quote unquote villains, even in our fictional stories and our narratives that we write, to see that there's deeper character there. If you have someone who's just an evil monstrosity, it's a 2D character. It's not worth reading about. Yeah. But this is a human being. This is a real life character who obviously has 3 dimensions. There's more to him than just an evil villain who killed Hamilton. There's a lot more going on there. And this is a redeemable character in a lot of ways. And there's a reason why he has associations of people who love him. He did write a lot of great things. He did a lot of good things for our government. A lot of people saw him as a founding father and a hero.
And after that list of 10 things that you found, it's important to note that next week we're going to dive into the song Stay Alive and the 10 duel commandments, where we get to see the important rules of dueling and establish what we're going to need to know for some important key scenes in the second act.
Right. Thanks for listening, and join us in this conversation. You can find us on Twitter at Graphocast and on Facebook at facebook.com/Graphocast. That's GRAPHOCAST. Until next week, wait for it. I'm Vinton at Flesh Eater on Twitter.
And I'm Robbie Hurlocker at Alpha Knight. If you're enjoying what you're listening to, be sure to rate and subscribe.
This has been a Graphomania production. If you would like to hear more podcasts, go to graphocast.com, GRAPHOCAST.com. Follow us on Twitter at Graphocast and like the Graphomania page on Facebook for news and updates.